Hey guys, what's going on? Mark Jones, BlackTail Carpentry. Today I will be making a fake live edge black epoxy walnut river table. It'll have paneled walnut and sapelli legs. It'll have a white oak and walnut shelf. As I start off, I start freehanding a couple of these rough cuts. I don't know why I didn't use my miter gauge. I still got the job done. I don't recommend. It was just too big. I don't have a runoff table. Still got the job done anyways. I was getting a rough estimate, leaving it long so that I could make the form for the top, starting on the top right away. Here's a quick preview. I'm going to build a form first so that the epoxy, which takes 3 days to dry, has time to cure. For some reason, I walked away from my table saw here as it was running and continued the base of my form. Quick preview of the top right away. That's what I'm going for. And now I end up doing the sides for the form. And I don't like the way I did the sides. I wish I gave myself more room to play when I poured the epoxy. Here I go. Right away screwing. For some reason I didn't pre-drill. I don't know. I guess I didn't want to bring out another tool even though my drill and my impact are right next to each other. Still got the job done. I would have pocket hole screwed these side pieces down. Again, this is the first time I'm doing this, so I got the job done. It was hot. Using some of this Tyvek tape so that the epoxy doesn't stick to my MDF form here. Now, the Tyvek tape I got from Home Depot, but it was so freaking hard to find because it was in the back corner at the very bottom of the shelf. It was so hard to find. I walked past it 3 times before having to ask. So there goes the top. And what I did was, see, I used this Rustic Walnut. It's got a lot of imperfections, and I freehand cut it because I wanted this room along the sides so that I could pour epoxy in there. Here I go cutting some sapelli because I'm going to also glue up a panel so that dries and I can start working on that while I wait 3 days for this epoxy to dry. Here goes the epoxy. I went with the first one. I put just a layer there to hold everything together so it wouldn't move. Everywhere that's white and on the sides, I put epoxy. I put some shellac on the face of it so that when I use the black epoxy, it won't stain the wood. Anywhere I put epoxy, you're going to want to scuff sand. So scuff sanding everything so that the epoxy that I later pour has something to adhere to. If you don't, it won't have a good bond. Here I go with the epoxy. I'm using a deep pour epoxy. I end up needing 64 ounces, so half of that twice is 32 and 32. I'm going to end up using some of that black acrylic paint because my pigments didn't come in time. You want to be as super accurate as possible, otherwise you won't get a good chemical reaction and it won't harden correctly. Getting real close in eye level to make sure I have the most accurate measurement. On the top, you can tell I really didn't give myself much room on the sides of the form. Dropping the paint in. Going for the mix. This is everybody's favorite part, watching the color change. My drill, I had to turn down the speeds of it because it was too powerful. I needed 2 hands in order to hold the bucket. Well, you know what? Maybe I needed more than 2 hands because I ended up dropping it down using 4 hands, 2 being my feet. After I waited, mixing that for 6 minutes, I waited 3 minutes, popped all the bubbles before I started pouring. Fun with the propane torch. And now everybody's favorite part, the pour. And boy, was it difficult. I am so glad I did not spill on my table there, which it looked like it was going to do. It just didn't flow out of the bucket very easily. I was super nervous doing this after that first pour. It flowed pretty good, but very hard to control, as you can later see up here in my other pour right there, and yet not even close to the void I was trying to fill. Well, anyways, up all over the table again. I'm going to end up coming back with a credit card and whatever was overflowed, pushing to the side cracks that I wanted to keep the fake live edge. The rustic walnut was so much cheaper than any live edge slab, and I made it look exactly how I wanted. Here it is after I used a credit card to push everything. I got all the bubbles out except for right here. I just had like 3 or 4 bubbles that I end up sanding out perfectly fine later. Okay, I planed down this top off screen because it was after work and I didn't have time with the sun going down to set it up. So there was one low spot here that I'm just going to end up sanding because the planer is actually good enough to sand, and I'm going to fill all these little areas like these bubbles with just clear epoxy. It'll end up showing up black because it'll be transparent. So there was one problem, and it was this little area right here. I nicked it with the planer. This would be called snipe. Very unfortunate, but I am going to round over the edge so it won't be invisible, but you'd have to kind of look for it rather than it being a massive void here. And I wanted the maximum length, otherwise I would just cut off that inch, and that's why you leave it extra long. But I ended up wanting more on my top than this. I ended up not putting any tape over here as a form because it's so close that it's going to end up sanding out, and I'm going to profile this edge so right there you won't even see it. But anyways, it would have just been a waste of epoxy. Any of these flat areas you're going to want to sand so that the epoxy adheres better. Here I am, I'm using 220 sandpaper, making sure I hit everything. Don't need to do the rough spot that's planed because any epoxy will stick that just fine. Here I am I'm just going with clear epoxy, filling every crack, crevice, nook, cranny. I end up, if there's anything that doesn't get epoxy in it, see I'm trying to push it down in the crack a little bit there. If anything does not go in the crack, I'll end up coming back and hitting it with some CA glue. I want to be as thin as possible. I really don't want to have any major buildup that's difficult to sand, so that's why I'm here spreading this epoxy out so that it cures a little faster. Again, I'm using this epoxy it cures about after 6 hours, but I went to work the next day, came back, so I gave it probably like 22 hours before I ended up coming back and planing off or sanding off. I think I just sanded off this little bit. Here I am going for that kind of sniped area that I had earlier, filling that with epoxy. And like I said, I ended up coming back over with a profile on a router, so it ends up looking, you can hardly notice it. After this cures, I ended up sanding, and you want to hit, this is the bottom right now, you want to hit the whole, every area, nook, cranny, and as you're sanding this, you want to make sure you try focusing on the epoxy more than the walnut, because the epoxy is actually harder than the walnut, and it'll take longer to sand than the walnut, so you don't want to stay in one area too much. See, I got a lump here that's been difficult to sand so far. I end up sanding this with every single grit. I end up going all the way up to 220, as you can see here. That was my final grit on the bottom. I sanded it all the way to 220 on the bottom. Just a lot of sanding in this project. You gotta have fun with it. At least try to, at least. As I was doing this top, I was simultaneously working on the paneled legs. And not every glue up is particularly easy, so I'm hitting this starting with 80 grit sandpaper to level it out, so there's no high spots. I end up coming back and filling it with epoxy later. These couple of cracks that were there, black epoxy. Here's the bottom of my top that I used a grain filler in here, and it wasn't a clear grain filler, so that's why I did it on the bottom. I was very upset with this. I do not recommend. I put shellac on the bottom just to kind of seal it while I work on the top. This is the top. That's the bottom of the top. This is the part that everything's going to sit on, the face of the the whole end table. This is my best preview of the top so far. If you like this, let me know in the comments below. Maybe you'd do something a little different. Just let me know. We'll have a little conversation. Keep sanding it all the way. I wish I logged my hours on how much I sanded. Oh! These are all the planer marks I'm working to remove. You start with a lower grit. It's more aggressive. It'll go quicker. You can't jump right to the high grits, otherwise it won't work. Just keep sanding away, and I wish I logged my hours on how long I sanded. I mean, it was a big project. I had a lot of fun with it. It was my first really big project that I worked with, and that's why I kind of decided to film it and put it up here on YouTube. Occasionally check the sander to make sure there's no buildup and that you're sanding with the clean paper. This is my best shot of the snipe that I had. And now here's a preview of the top. This is pretty much what it's going to look like, but what I'm going to do is I have to fill all these little nooks and crannies that did not get epoxy, little imperfections here. And before I do that, I'm cleaning it with some mineral spirits as I clean most of it just to get all the sawdust off. You check the rag here in a sec. I believe I show you. Yep, you see that rag is filthy. Now, water would raise the grain. That's why you use the mineral spirits. See how filthy that rag is. And mineral spirits will, in the heat, will dry faster than water, so it'll be a little quicker process. You really want to clean out all these grooves and cracks and get ready for the CA glue that I'm going to put on here. Just to speed up the process, I'm giving it a little wipe down. Didn't really do much, but, you know. At the very least, I was trying to get any excess dust that was there building up. Here I come in with the CA glue. Here's the CA glue. There's the glue, and this is the activator. This is what makes it dry in literally 1 second. So any little hole or imperfection, little dab of glue, shot of activator. And it is really that fast. Working on a glue up here, and you want to make sure you get enough glue to cover the entire surface. And if you look closely, as you can see, I have a clamp underneath so that when I'm done with spreading the glue, that I'm not fumbling around looking for a clamp and then trying to squeeze it underneath my workpieces, and it's too difficult and I got glue dripping literally everywhere. When glue is evenly spread in a simple butt joint, the glue fibers are stronger than the wood fibers. That means if you were to take a wood joint held together by glue and break it, the wood would fail and crack before the glue were to crack. Now that I have the glue all evenly spread, I'm going to lay my pieces down. Look how easy it is. I got that clamp ready to go. You want to also alternate your clamps so that it's equal, even pressure so that the boards do not bow in the cure time. Moving on back to the top, this is the bottom of the top. I have sanded this down to 220 grit. I have maybe 3 coats of shellac on here. It's pretty nice and smooth. This is just the bottom. I'm not too worried about it. It doesn't have to be super protective. Nothing's ever going to touch the bottom of this. But there were some imperfections you have to get out. So to get those out, here's with the 220, you want to make sure you start your sander on the workpiece before you turn on the sander. Otherwise, you're going to gouge deep scratch marks into your wood, or in this case, into your finish. Now that I've sanded this off, you can tell it's cured because there's this thin powder, which is beautiful and perfect. That's exactly what you're looking for. Now, I'm going to put a final coat of shellac on here, but first I'm going to clear all of that dust that I just showed you off with mineral spirits. And I don't know why, but for some reason, when doing this project, I was really in love with the mineral spirits. See me slopping it all over. You really don't need to use as much as it was. Maybe because it was so hot and it was drying pretty fast, I wanted to really lather it on there. I don't know. It doesn't make any sense to me. Trying to evenly spread this out so it dries relatively quick. Here I got a time lapse coming up of roughly how long it took for this to dry. I was inside for 6 minutes, I remember that. And then once that was dry, or at least close enough to dry, I opened this can of shellac, getting ready to finish the bottom of this one last time with my final coat of shellac. Using one of these blue paper towels as an applicator, I always fold my paper towels the same way. I tri-fold them, and into thirds to get the most surface area that I can for the shellac. And what I don't do here that I would recommend is I would recommend pouring the shellac into a separate container so that you do not contaminate your entire supply of shellac. But I was using this shellac throughout the entire project just to seal wood so that when I could not get to it in time, that the wood would not warp or cup or bow any of my panels while I was waiting in between days because ran out of daylight, ran out of time to do the project. Now I'm trying to get as even as a coat here as possible because this is my final coat of shellac. And as you see, once I get to the black epoxy, it turns jet black. See how beautiful it is? There's no more milky haze as there previously was from when it was sanded. Now, when you sand, you do want to make the epoxy look as uniform and cloudy as possible. Otherwise, you're going to see the scratch marks in the epoxy. I don't have an outfeed table for my table saw, so what I needed to do was I needed to cut my paneled legs to size. So in order to do that, I needed a hand, so I called upon my father to help me. No one else would have trusted for this task. Me and my dad are oftentimes on the same page when it comes to quality and control. Almost like in How I Met Your Mother, when Marshall and Lily would talk to each other without using any words, just facial recognition. So as we push this through here very carefully so that everybody stays safe and there's no kickback, we do one, and then we're going to do the two legs and the top. So by using this jig, which is called a joiner jig, we are truing up one side of the material perfectly square with the fence. So then we can come back later without the jig and we can have two parallel sides to each other. So now here we're cutting the top. This is the last one. We're doing this together. We're not using the jig. We jigged it on one side. This is our final width and parallel side. So as you can see, I left a little bit of that round over edge, the edge, so that I can round it over. My final width here being 15 5/8 heavy, I can now get my top where my legs are going to be for me to route out. I'm going to do 15 so that I have a little bit of overlap in the front and the back. Deciding on 14 3/4 heavy, I'm going to by myself now rip the two paneled legs perfectly parallel with each other so I can then glue them into the top of my tabletop. Without having to move the fence, I go straight for the second panel leg so that it's easy, perfectly the same exact thickness on the panel legs. Now that I have my final width on my paneled legs, I'm going to final sand so that I can be ready for glue up and finish once I cross cut them to my final height. I sanded these sides all the way up to 220 sandpaper. I took my time with the roughest sandpaper earlier, 80 grit, and then I kind of busted through the other ones until I got to 220. Again, you want to make sure that you start your sander once you've already come in contact with your material. And I'm spending extra time on every seam just so that it's a smooth transition. Cleaning these legs one last time with mineral spirits before I end up going ahead and cutting them to their final height. And I'm going to cut them to their final height two separate ways. I'm going to use a fence with my skill saw, and I'm also going to use my miter saw. First I'm going to do here is use my skill saw with a rip fence. What I'm doing here is I'm measuring the distance from the edge tooth of the blade to the end of my saw bed so that I know exactly where my cut line will be when I measure where I can put my fence. Setting up my fence so that I can run my saw along it using the piece of wood as a guide. I normally like to use twist clamps rather than squeeze clamps because they just hold a little bit better, gives me more confidence while I'm cutting. Once again, doing the exact same thing to get my straight line. You could also use, if you have a track saw, it would give you the exact same results as setting up your own fence with just a plain regular circular skill saw. doing the same to the other side now. I end up thinning down some shellac with denatured alcohol. By doing this, it flows a little bit better. As you can see, I'm using a disposable foam brush as opposed to the blue shop towel that I was using, just because it's a little bit better control than the shop towel. So I'm going to go over this. It's good practice going from side to side. I don't exactly start on the edge because otherwise a lot of the shellac will drip off the side. So I come in a little and then finish the edge. I'm going to cover all areas thoroughly. Going to end up coming back and I'm going to make sure that I get the sides of the panel, because that's where the most cupping would happen, would be the end grain. The end grain will also want to absorb a lot more shellac than the edge grain or the face grain of the material. And as you can see here, I'm spending a little extra time on that end grain just because it soaks up a lot more. Shellac dries pretty quick regularly, but with thinning it down with denatured alcohol, it dries even quicker. So as you can see, there's only like 2 or 3 streaks there, and the rest is dry. Just a couple of streaks that are wet still. Speeding up here just because we get the process now. I'm going to really take my time going full length side to side, and now moving on to the top. These are going to be my final cuts for the top. And I'm using my miter saw, and since I have no table there, my father is once again going to hold it for me. As you can see, the epoxy cuts a lot thicker than sawdust. Kind of funny, and unfortunately my saw was like 2 inches too short. I had to flip it over and make 2 cuts, which was very upsetting because one of my favorite tools is the compound miter saw, and now flipping it over, I'm going to make my final cut, my final number, this being my final cut dimension. Again, it's too short, so I'm going to have to flip it over and do it again. My dad's checking out the cut. Noticed I did a pretty good job. Thanks for the help, Dad. All right. Here we are, just admiring the top. The fake live edge is a look that I was actually trying for a little while, and we're very pleased with what happened with it. The best tip I can give everybody, and honestly I would like to take my own advice, is vacuum up immediately, because if you let the piles sit around, they end up becoming harder to vacuum up than if you were to vacuum it immediately. Now taking it over to my router table, I had to bring my router table outside. I attached the vacuum right away because the dust collection on this is actually pretty good. I end up doing a 45-degree chamfer for the very top, and then I end up coming back on the bottom and doing a just 1/8 inch round over bit on the underside so that it's not a sharp touch. Testing out a piece to get my desired depth and running the round over along the bottom now. Using the router table because I can firmly plant the base on the table so that I get an accurate cut, and the router is not wobbling around in my hand, just balancing along the edge. I have a flat surface that I can push against and get a much better control. Look real quick to the left, you can see I filled some epoxy in whatever imperfections were left on the paneled legs. Now I'm routing out the area where I can slip in the paneled legs so that I can put a glue up and attach the top to the legs. I did the same idea with the rip fence, measured from the edge of the tooth to where I could hit the fence so that I could get the cut that I wanted. Major mistake, do not recommend. I'm clearly squinting here. Wear some safety glasses, guys. Come on, this is ridiculous. I don't know why I didn't, but all I can suggest is wear some safety glasses. Now I'm checking, and 3/4 is not going to be good enough. I'm I'm going to have to make that management later. Cleaning off my top real good, and I'm going to go with this Rubio Monaco Pure. The internet raves about it. It's 2 parts, 3-to-1 oil, 1 part activator. I gotta say sorry about this shot because I did this after work and the sun is directly into the camera, so I'm sorry about that. But it's pretty easy. Measure out 3-to-1. All you do is use the card scraper and wipe it on, leave it sit for a few minutes, cover all areas, and then you're gonna end up wiping it off. What I did was I used the scraper on the face. I tried using the scraper on the sides. It wasn't working, so I come back with a blue shop towel. Flipping it around to make sure that I get a good reach on every little angle that I can get, and then just simply wipe it off. It's really easy. It's easier than any other finish out there. You can't only wipe off as much oil as possible. If you leave any on, it doesn't cure properly, and it only sticks to the wood fibers. So now to get a little further, I'm going to try driving it in with this little buffing pad I bought. I bought it off Amazon. It was like $4.99, I think. I did it. There was 2 of them, and I was just testing this out. I'm not saying I'd recommend this, but I wanted to save the old elbow grease for a little while and use this buffing pad. My last glue up, I need some white oak for the shelf, and here it is once the shelf is all ready, about ready to just take it out of the clamps. Cutting the panels and the shelves to their final dimensions so that I can get ready for final assembly and figure out what my final height is going to be. Once again, unfortunately, my saw is not big enough. It's the biggest throat any saw has, but unfortunately, my panel is just too big, and I have to flip it over. Now, I'm cutting a rabbet with my router here. I could have used my table saw with a dado stack, but I had my router out already, and I thought it would have been easier than if I were to change my regular saw blade into a dado stack. Now I'm just doing a check here to make sure this would fit for a glue up. It checked out, so I'm doing it again to the other side. Now I'm just double checking my numbers here to make sure everything fits. I end up going from the edge tooth of my router bit to where the edge of the plastic ring is on the router, and then once again without safety glasses I'm going ahead and cutting it to whatever depth I thought was sufficient enough for a significant glue up. The moment you've all been waited for, a pre-assembly dry fit. Now this fit, but not exactly as I wanted to, and it took a little extra time. That's why I had my dad help me. Actually, you know what? It fit pretty good. Throwing a couple clamps on here just to make sure that I have a proper space for gluing up. I'm trying to figure out my ideal height for the shelf because I don't want it to be in the center. I want it to be down a little bit. I got about 7 3/4 there, marking my line so that I can once again use the router to cut exactly where I want the shelf to sit. My grandma used to always call me whenever I talked to her on the phone. Before she got off the line, she'd always say, measure once, cut twice. The old proverb, measure once, cut twice. So I've taken that into consideration with every project I've ever done, measuring twice and cutting once, checking every number before I cut. And here we go, once again without safety glasses, and there is my dado for the shelf to sit in. That's one leg going to the other. I'm going to do the exact same number. You do the exact same number twice, and guess what? You've got a square 90-degree angle. The router bit was a 3/4 router bit, and my wood for the shelf was slightly over 3/4. So I'm just, whatever my depth is right there, I'm making it the height of my saw blade, and then I'm moving the fence over to the maximum width of my router bit. Here I am using my combo square to get that exact depth. Now I need to make myself a table saw sled that has a high fence where I can just push this along my fence. This is kind of sketchy right here, but the blade was only sticking out a little bit more than 3/8 of an inch, so I was comfortable cutting this by myself. I'm just making this little rabbet so that it would fit inside my dado. that I had just cut on the paneled legs before I glue everything up together. Successful cut on the one side and flipping it over for the other one. That black mark is from the clamp that I had. I think I used a pipe clamp when I did this, and there's oils on the pipe clamp. It ended up sanding out fine. I had to sand a little longer than I wanted to, but it ended up working, so it doesn't really matter. Once I'm finished with that, I sanded it up to 220, making sure I got that black mark out. And then before I get ready for a full glue up, dumping some more mineral spirits on, and once again, far too much. I was really mineral spirits happy on this project, but man, look at that shine. It just looks so beautiful. A lot of people make chessboards out of walnut and white oak because they're contrasting colors and look really good together. Once again, thanks for watching, and here is my favorite part of this video, the glue assembly. Yeah, it was a lot tighter than the pre-dry fit, so it wasn't exactly perfect, so I'm routing over the little bit of overlap that I had, which is perfectly fine. But once we got it together and glued, this is a day later, I'm coming back getting ready for the foot that I'm going to put on here. I ended up just simple 45 trimmed around it, just a simple foot, 45-degree angles. This is to elevate it off of the ground so that over time, if there is wood movement, if a whole panel is sitting on the ground, it might cup and rock. But if you sit it off the ground a little bit, then the foot still has three corners to sit on rather than rolling on one point. Sealing the bottom with shellac. This is actually going to be a finish coat of shellac. I end up hitting shellac on the bottom just to give it a little bit extra support when I come back with this matte spray lacquer. Now, I have an HBLP spray gun, but I use this Wacoat matte sheen spray lacquer. Now, I decided to use this can because I could not find matte sheen anywhere else other than in this spray can. If anybody knows where I can get a matte lacquer, please leave it in the comments. Now, I taped off the part that's going to be glued up to the top, just because if you're to use the finish, the lacquer finish, you will not have a good wood glue bond. You want the best bond you possibly can because you want this to last a lifetime, a generation, whatever. I have it elevated off the ground a little bit so that I'm not spraying the grass, I'm just spraying the wood. I ended up using 3 coats, which ended up taking like 2.5 cans. Now, there's a couple of imperfections all throughout the piece, but it was like my first big piece. Here's one right here. One of the Sapelli pieces didn't quite match up, but oh well, we're going to live with it. I wish I had a little bit more walnut to contrast with that white oak there. Here I am going with the top, making sure that it would fit. All my numbers lined up, so I knew it would be a tight fit, but a little tricky. I ended up getting it perfectly fine though. At least perfectly fine after a couple of hits with the old mallet. Once again, thanks for watching. If you have any projects, any ideas that you like me to try out, let me know. I'm always up to do something, but it's more about motivation than time. Once you get an idea, you really want to go and get it done. After a successful glue up, here's a few images and videos of the finished product. I didn't take them until it snowed, of course, though. Thanks for watching.